Welcome, my friends, to another historical sleep journey. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2 centuries as a soldier in Napoleon's army, when Europe trembled at the sound of marching boots and the thunder of cannons. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe this channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1805 into the muddy boots of a common soldier in the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen, Napoleon's Grande Armée. Picture yourself awakening not to the gentle buzz of an alarm clock, but to the harsh blast of a bugle at 4 in the morning. The year is 1805, and you've somehow found yourself enlisted, perhaps willingly, perhaps not, in the army of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would reshape Europe through sheer force of will and military genius. The ground beneath you is hard, unforgiving earth, and your bed is nothing more than a thin blanket wrapped around straw if you're fortunate, or simply the bare ground if you're not. As your eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness, you realize that the romantic notions of military glory that might have filled your head are about to meet the brutal reality of 19th century warfare. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and wood smoke from the dying embers of last night's campfires. Around you, 30,000 other souls are stirring to life, each beginning what might very well be their last day on Earth. The bugle's call echoes across the vast encampment, and you feel the immediate shock of cold morning air against your face. In Napoleon's army, there was no such thing as sleeping in, no matter how exhausted you might be from the previous day's march. The drill sergeants, men whose voices could cut through the din of battle itself, are already moving through the ranks, rousing any stragglers with none too gentle prods from their boots. You sit up, your back aching from sleeping on ground that seems determined to find every sensitive spot on your body. Your uniform, if you can call it that, is a study in practical misery. The blue coat that once might have made you feel proud is now stained with mud, sweat, and things you'd rather not identify. The brass buttons, tarnished and loose, catch what little light filters through the morning mist. Your white breeches, white being a rather optimistic description at this point, are damp with dew and cling uncomfortably to your legs. The reality of personal hygiene in Napoleon's army would shock our modern sensibilities. Bathing was a luxury reserved for officers, and even then it was infrequent. The average soldier might go weeks, even months, without a proper wash. The closest you'd come to cleanliness was a quick splash of cold water from whatever stream or well you happened upon during the march. Your hair, grown long as was the fashion, is matted and greasy, often home to an entire ecosystem of lice and other unwelcome visitors. But here's something that might surprise you about Napoleon's military machine. Despite the harsh conditions, it was remarkably organized for its time. Every soldier had a specific place, a specific role, and a specific set of expectations. The Grande Armée wasn't just a collection of armed peasants. It was a carefully orchestrated instrument of war, with systems and procedures that would influence military organization for generations to come. As you struggle to your feet, your stomach immediately reminds you of another harsh reality: hunger, the gnawing, constant companion that would follow you throughout your service. Military rations in 1805 were a far cry from the carefully balanced MREs of modern armies. If you were lucky, you'd receive your daily bread ration, a hard, often moldy loaf that required the jaw strength of a draft horse to consume. This bread, baked days or even weeks ago, was frequently infested with weevils, but you'd learn quickly that protein was protein, regardless of how many legs it had. Take a moment to really imagine this. You're standing in a field somewhere in what might be Austria or Prussia, surrounded by thousands of men who smell as badly as you do, all of you facing the prospect of another day of marching, fighting, or quite possibly dying. The sun hasn't even risen yet, and already your day is more challenging than most people in our modern era would face in a month. Napoleon famously said that an army marches on its stomach, but he might have added that it also survives on its wits. As the morning progresses and you fall into formation with your regiment, you begin to understand one of the most crucial skills of Napoleon's soldiers, the art of foraging. This wasn't simply a matter of finding food, it was about survival itself, and those who mastered it lived while others perished. The official rations, when they existed at all, were woefully inadequate. A soldier was supposed to receive daily portions of bread, meat, and wine or brandy, but supply lines were notoriously unreliable. Battles were won or lost not just by superior tactics, but by which army could keep its soldiers fed. This meant that much of your time would be spent not in glorious combat, but in the decidedly unglamorous task of scrounging for anything edible. Picture yourself, musket slung over your shoulder, creeping through a farmyard in the early morning light. Your stomach hasn't seen a proper meal in 3 days, and the sight of chickens pecking in the dirt fills you with a predatory focus that would surprise your peacetime self. But this isn't simple theft. This is survival, and every soldier in Napoleon's army became an expert in what the military euphemistically called requisitioning supplies. The farmers whose lands you'd cross learned to hide their livestock and bury their grain at the first sight of military uniforms. They knew that armies were like locusts, consuming everything in their path. A single regiment could strip a village bare in a matter of hours, leaving behind only empty storehouses and the bitter resentment of people who had worked all year to grow what was consumed in a single meal. But soldiers developed ingenious methods for finding hidden supplies. They learned to read the landscape like a book, spotting the telltale signs of recently disturbed earth where grain might be buried, or noticing the absence of animals that suggested they'd been driven into hiding. Some soldiers became so skilled at this that they could smell buried food from remarkable distances. The cooking methods available to you would test every bit of creativity you possessed. Forget about ovens, stoves, or even proper cookware. Most soldiers carried a single metal cup and perhaps a knife. Everything else had to be improvised. You'd learn to create cooking fires that produced minimal smoke to avoid giving away your position to enemy scouts. You discover that a soldier's helmet could serve as an excellent cooking pot, and that leather from worn-out boots could be boiled into a surprisingly nutritious, if unpalatable, broth. One of the most ingenious aspects of Napoleon's army was how soldiers learned to preserve food during times of plenty for the inevitable times of scarcity. They'd smoke meat over small fires, pack salt around fish or pork when salt was available, and even learned primitive methods of fermentation that could make spoiled vegetables safe to eat. If you're finding this journey into the past relaxing, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There's something oddly soothing about understanding how people survived and thrived under conditions that would challenge us so greatly today. The social dynamics around food in the army created a complex web of relationships and hierarchies. Successful foragers were valuable members of any unit, and they often traded their skills for other necessities. A soldier who could consistently find food might exchange his surplus for shoe leather, needle and thread, or even a few precious sheets of paper to write home. These informal economies within the army were essential for survival and created bonds between soldiers that often lasted long after the wars ended. Now let's walk, quite literally, through one of the most defining experiences of being a soldier in Napoleon's army. The march. Not the glorious parade ground marching you might imagine, but the grinding, day after day movement of tens of thousands of men, horses, crack, and equipment across the varied terrain of Europe. Your feet, encased in boots that were likely made for someone else's feet entirely, begin their daily torture routine. Military boots in 1805 were not the precisely fitted, ergonomically designed footwear of modern armies. They were leather shells, often secondhand, that you'd stuff with whatever material you could find, straw, paper, cloth torn from enemy uniforms, to create some semblance of comfort. The leather was untreated and would either remain rigid as wood or become so waterlogged that it would fall apart at the seams. The pace of Napoleon's marches was legendary throughout Europe. His armies could cover distances that seemed impossible to his enemies, appearing at battlefields days ahead of when they were expected. This wasn't magic, it was the result of careful planning and the extraordinary endurance of common soldiers like yourself. A typical day's march would cover between 15 and 20 miles, but during rapid deployments, you might be expected to cover 30 miles or more. Imagine the rhythm of it. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, repeated tens of thousands of times each day. The sound of thousands of boots hitting the ground in rough unison creates a drum beat that becomes the soundtrack of your existence. Mixed with this is the creaking of leather, the clanking of metal equipment, the occasional curse when someone stumbles, and the constant background noise of thousands of men trying to maintain conversation while walking. The roads of early 19th century Europe were not the smooth highways we know today. Most were little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain and became clouds of dust in dry weather. In spring and fall, you'd be walking through ankle-deep mud that would suck the boots right off your feet if you weren't careful. The mud wasn't just inconvenient, it was actively dangerous. Men would lose their footing and be trampled by those behind them, or the effort of pulling their feet free from the sucking mud would exhaust them to the point of collapse. During winter marches, the conditions became truly horrific. Picture yourself walking across frozen ground so hard that each step sends shockwaves up through your bones. Your breath forms clouds in the frigid air, and any exposed skin burns with cold. The retreat from Moscow in 1812 became legendary precisely because it represented the extreme end of what human endurance could withstand. But even routine winter marches tested soldiers to their limits. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of these marches was the uncertainty. You rarely knew where you were going, how long it would take to get there, or what would be waiting for you when you arrived. Rumors would spread through the ranks like wildfire. You were marching to engage the enemy, you were retreating to winter quarters, you were being transferred to a different theater of war entirely. The lack of information created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that was almost as exhausting as the physical effort of walking. Yet, within this grueling routine, soldiers developed remarkable coping mechanisms. They'd sing, not the patriotic songs you might expect, but often bawdy, humorous ballads that mocked officers, complained about conditions, or told stories of home. These songs served multiple purposes. They helped maintain the rhythm of the march, provided entertainment during the long hours, and created a sense of shared experience among the men. Soldiers also developed an almost supernatural ability to sleep while walking. During particularly long marches, you'd learn to doze while putting one foot in front of the other, your body moving through muscle memory, while your mind escaped into brief moments of rest. This skill was essential for survival, as there were often no opportunities for proper sleep during rapid movements. One aspect of military life that might surprise you is how quickly soldiers formed bonds with their fellow troops. When you're sharing every hardship, every danger, and every small victory with the same group of men day after day, relationships develop that are unlike anything in civilian life. Your tent mates, your messmates, the men who march beside you, these become more than friends. They become family in the truest sense, bound together by shared experiences that no one outside the military could truly understand. Picture the evening scene as your regiment finally stops for the night. The formal structure of military hierarchy relaxes slightly as soldiers gather around small fires, sharing whatever food they've managed to acquire during the day's march. Conversations flow between French soldiers, German auxiliaries, Italian volunteers, and Polish lancers. Napoleon's army was truly international, a collection of men from across Europe united under a single banner. The language barriers that you might expect to create divisions actually led to fascinating cultural exchanges. Soldiers learned bits of each other's languages, shared cooking techniques from their homelands, and told stories that crossed cultural boundaries through gesture and shared laughter. A German soldier might teach French troops a method for preserving sausage, while an Italian would share techniques for making pasta from foraged grains. These evening gatherings were also where news traveled through the army. Official communications moved through military channels, but the real information, rumors about enemy movements, stories of battles fought by other units, news from home, spread through these informal networks. Soldiers developed an almost telepathic ability to sense morale throughout the army. They could feel when confidence was high, when fear was spreading, or when something significant was about to happen. The sharing of resources went far beyond food. If one man's boots wore out, others would contribute pieces of leather, cord, or knowledge of repair techniques. When someone fell ill, his tent mates would carry his equipment, share their rations, and tend to him as they would a brother. This mutual support system was essential for survival in an era when military medical care was rudimentary at best. Writing materials were precious commodities, and soldiers who could read and write often found themselves serving as scribes for their illiterate comrades. Picture yourself dictating a letter to your family back home, struggling to find words that would reassure them of your safety while avoiding any mention of the constant dangers you faced. These letters, when they could be sent at all, often took months to reach their destinations, and replies were even rarer. The gambling that went on around these evening fires was legendary. Soldiers would bet on anything: card games, dice, which regiment would march first the next morning, how many enemy soldiers they'd encounter. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of creating artificial excitement and hope in lives that were otherwise dominated by uncertainty and hardship. I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're finding this journey into Napoleon's army as fascinating as I do. There's something deeply human about these stories of survival and camaraderie that transcends the centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, soldiers in Napoleon's army developed their own culture, complete with customs, traditions, and unwritten rules that governed behavior. Veterans would initiate newcomers into the mysteries of military life, teaching them everything from how to sleep soundly despite the sound of distant cannon fire, to which officers could be trusted and which were to be avoided at all costs. Now we come to the aspect of military life that dominates most people's imagination, but actually occupied a relatively small portion of a soldier's time: actual combat. The reality of fighting in Napoleon's era would be almost incomprehensibly foreign to our modern understanding of warfare. Picture yourself standing in a formation with hundreds of other men, shoulder to shoulder, so close that you can smell the fierce sweat of the soldier next to you and feel his trembling transmitted through the pressed ranks. The weapons you'd carry were marvels of 18th century technology, but would seem impossibly primitive by today's standards. Your primary weapon would be a musket, likely a Charleville musket if you were French, that was nearly as tall as you were and weighed about 10 pounds. This wasn't a precision instrument. It was more like a sophisticated club that happened to fire lead balls when properly loaded and primed. Loading this musket in combat conditions required a complex sequence of actions that you'd practice thousands of times until they became automatic. You'd bite open a paper cartridge containing gunpowder and a lead ball, pour some powder into the firing pan, dump the rest down the barrel, ram the ball, and paper down with a steel ramrod. Cock the hammer, aim, though aim is a generous term given the weapon's accuracy, and fire. A skilled soldier could manage perhaps 3 shots per minute under ideal conditions, but combat conditions were never ideal. The smoke from black powder weapons created a fog of war that was quite literal. After the first few volleys, the battlefield would be shrouded in thick, choking smoke that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. You'd be firing at muzzle flashes in the smoke, hoping that the shadowy figures you glimpsed were enemies rather than your own men who had become separated in the chaos. The sound of battle was overwhelming in ways that our modern world can barely prepare us for. The crash of hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously was like standing inside a thunderstorm, but worse, because it was continuous and combined with the screams of wounded men, the whinnying of terrified horses, and the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain control over the chaos. But here's what might surprise you about Napoleonic combat. Most of the fighting wasn't done by infantry with muskets. Artillery, cannons of various sizes, dominated the battlefield and caused the majority of casualties. The sound of incoming cannonballs was distinctive and terrifying, a low whistling that grew louder and higher in pitch as the ball approached. Experienced soldiers learned to judge from the sound whether a ball would pass overhead or land nearby, but there was often little they could do with this knowledge except hope. The psychological challenge of standing in formation while cannonballs tore through your ranks was immense. Military discipline required that you remain in position even as the men around you were killed or maimed. The famous British thin red line and Napoleon's columns weren't just tactical formations. They were triumphs of human will over the most basic survival instincts. Cavalry charges were perhaps the most terrifying experience an infantry soldier could face. Picture the ground shaking beneath your feet as hundreds of horses thundered toward your position, their riders wielding sabers that glinted in the sunlight. The key to surviving a cavalry charge was maintaining formation. A solid square of infantry with bayonets pointed outward could repel almost any cavalry attack. But if the formation broke, if men panicked and ran, the cavalry would cut them down like wheat before a scythe. The reality of hand-to-hand combat was nothing like the choreographed sword fights of Hollywood movies. It was brutal, desperate, and usually over very quickly. Bayonets, long steel spikes attached to the ends of muskets, were the primary close combat weapons, but soldiers also used their muskets as clubs, threw rocks, and fought with whatever weapons they could improvise from the battlefield debris. Medical care for the wounded was primitive in the extreme. If you were injured, your best hope was that one of your comrades could drag you to the rear, where military surgeons worked under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Anesthesia didn't exist. The best you could hope for was a leather strap to bite down on or a shot of brandy to dull the pain. Amputation was the standard treatment for any serious wound to an arm or leg, and the mortality rate from infection was astronomical. One of the most fascinating aspects of Napoleon's military machine was the incredible ingenuity soldiers developed when it came to engineering and construction. Modern armies have specialized engineering corps with advanced equipment, but in 1805, every soldier was expected to be part engineer, part carpenter, and part architect when the situation demanded it. Picture yourself approaching a river that your army needs to cross. There's no bridge, the water is too deep to ford, and the enemy may be approaching from behind. In our modern world, this would require specialized equipment, careful planning, and professional engineers. In Napoleon's army, it was just Tuesday. Soldiers became masters at constructing pontoon bridges using whatever materials were available. They'd lash together wooden planks, doors torn from abandoned houses, even church pews to create floating platforms. These bridges had to be strong enough to support not just marching infantry, but artillery pieces weighing several tons and cavalry units with their horses and equipment. The speed at which Napoleon's armies could construct these temporary bridges was legendary. What might take modern engineers days to plan and execute, soldiers in 1805 could accomplish in hours through pure necessity and accumulated experience. Veterans would teach newcomers the tricks of the trade: how to judge water current, which types of wood would support the most weight, how to anchor bridge sections against the flow of the river. But bridge building was just one aspect of military engineering. Soldiers also had to construct defensive positions, often with nothing more than shovels, axes, and their bare hands. The famous redoubts and earthworks that dominated Napoleonic battlefields were built by soldiers who had learned to move earth with an efficiency that would impress modern construction workers. Imagine spending an entire night digging trenches and building earthworks, knowing that your life the next day would depend on how well you'd constructed your defenses. Every shovelful of dirt, every carefully placed log or stone could mean the difference between survival and death when the enemy artillery began firing. The tools available to soldiers for these construction projects were basic in the extreme. Most men carried a small entrenching tool, essentially a folding shovel, but major construction projects required soldiers to improvise tools from whatever materials they could find. Broken musket ramrods became pry bars, cooking pots served as buckets for moving water or wet concrete, and tent stakes doubled as hammers. Soldiers also became experts at demolition when retreat was necessary. They learned to destroy bridges, block roads, and disable artillery pieces so quickly and thoroughly that pursuing enemies would find nothing useful. This required not just knowledge of construction, but understanding of structural weak points and the most efficient methods of destruction. The winter quarters that armies constructed were marvels of improvised architecture. Using techniques passed down through generations of soldiers, men would build shelters that could house dozens of people, provide warmth through ingenious heating systems, and even include workshops for maintaining equipment and weapons. These winter camps were like temporary cities, complete with streets, drainage systems, and designated areas for different activities. Soldiers would construct ovens for baking bread, forges for metalwork, and even primitive hospitals for treating the sick and wounded. The organizational skills required to house, feed, and maintain tens of thousands of people in temporary accommodations were extraordinary. Something that rarely appears in dramatic depictions of Napoleonic warfare is the complex economic reality that soldiers faced every day. Money, or the lack thereof, was a constant concern that affected everything from morale to military effectiveness. Understanding how soldiers earned, spent, and saved money provides fascinating insights into daily life in Napoleon's army. A common soldier's pay was modest even by the standards of the time, and it was often months behind schedule. The French government's finances were constantly strained by the enormous costs of maintaining armies across Europe, and soldiers frequently went without pay for extended periods. This created an interesting dynamic where armies had to become partially self-sufficient, developing internal economies that operated alongside or instead of official military finance. Picture yourself as a soldier who hasn't been paid in 3 months. Your basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, are theoretically provided by the army, but in practice, you often have to supplement official rations and equipment through your own efforts. This is where soldiers became entrepreneurs, traders, and sometimes reluctant criminals. The trade in salvaged equipment was enormous and largely unofficial. After battles, soldiers would scour the battlefield for anything of value: weapons, ammunition, personal effects of the dead, even brass buttons that could be sold or traded. This wasn't ghoulish behavior. It was economic necessity. A good musket taken from a fallen enemy could be traded for food, a warm coat, or even a few coins to send home to family. Soldiers developed sophisticated bartering systems that operated across national and language barriers. A French soldier might trade captured Austrian buttons to a German ally in exchange for a waterproof cape, which he might later trade to a Polish lancer for a bottle of vodka, which could then be sold to an officer for actual money. These chains of trade created networks of relationships that extended throughout the army. The gambling that went on in military camps wasn't just entertainment. It was often a form of investment and risk management. Soldiers would bet their possessions, their rations, even their future pay on games of chance. Winners could accumulate enough resources to significantly improve their quality of life, while losers might find themselves dependent on the charity of their comrades. Some soldiers became specialists in particular types of trade. Men who could read and write might charge fees for writing letters for illiterate comrades. Those with medical knowledge could earn extra income treating minor ailments and injuries. Soldiers who had been craftsmen in civilian life, cobblers, tailors, blacksmiths, could use their skills to repair equipment for other soldiers in exchange for payment in food, money, or favors. The relationship between soldiers and civilian populations was complex and often economically driven. While armies certainly requisitioned supplies by force when necessary, they also engaged in more conventional trade relationships. Soldiers would offer their labor for civilian projects in exchange for food, lodging, or money. They might help with harvest work, construction projects, or other tasks that required strong backs and willing hands. Take a moment to consider how different this economic reality is from our modern world. Today, we're accustomed to regular paychecks, predictable expenses, and elaborate financial systems. For Napoleon soldiers, economic survival required constant creativity, careful planning, and a willingness to take risks that most of us would find uncomfortable. The sending of money home to families was a major concern for many soldiers, but the mechanisms for doing so were unreliable and expensive. Soldiers would often pool their resources to hire trusted individuals who were traveling in the right direction to carry letters and small amounts of money to their families. The failure of these informal systems could be catastrophic for families who depended on military pay for survival. Military life in Napoleon's era was profoundly shaped by the changing seasons in ways that our climate-controlled modern world makes difficult to appreciate. Each season brought its own challenges, opportunities, and rhythms that determined not just daily life, but major strategic decisions. Spring campaigns were times of renewed energy and optimism after the hardships of winter quarters. Picture yourself emerging from months of relative inactivity, your body soft from reduced physical activity, your equipment in need of repair after months of storage. The spring mobilization was like awakening from hibernation, but it required soldiers to quickly regain the physical and mental sharpness necessary for active campaigning. The roads that had been impassable due to winter snow and ice would become rivers of mud as the spring thaw began. This created a brief window where armies were trapped between winter immobility and summer mobility, forced to wait for conditions to improve enough to allow the movement of artillery and supply wagons. But spring also brought renewed access to food sources that had been unavailable during winter. Wild plants became edible again, providing vitamins and nutrients that had been scarce during the winter months. Soldiers who had learned to identify edible plants could significantly improve their diets and health during the spring months. Summer campaigning was the peak season for military activity, when armies could move quickly across dry roads and soldiers could sleep under the stars without fear of freezing to death. But summer brought its own challenges, particularly the problem of water. Armies of tens of thousands of men and horses required enormous amounts of fresh water daily, and finding adequate supplies in the heat of summer was a constant logistical challenge. The dust created by thousands of marching feet in dry summer weather was a particular torment. Picture yourself marching in a column that stretches for miles, breathing air thick with dust kicked up by the soldiers ahead of you. The dust got into everything, your food, your equipment, your clothes, and created respiratory problems that could be as debilitating as any enemy action. Heat exhaustion and sunstroke were constant dangers during summer campaigns. Soldiers wore wool uniforms designed for European climates, and the combination of heavy clothing, equipment weighing 60 pounds or more, and hot weather could be deadly. Experienced soldiers learned to pace themselves, conserve water, and recognize the early signs of heat-related illness in themselves and their comrades. But summer also provided the best opportunities for foraging and living off the land. Fruits and vegetables were available, livestock was fat from spring and summer grazing, and the long daylight hours provided more time for both marching and gathering supplies. Fall campaigns had a particular urgency because everyone knew that winter was approaching. There was often a race against time to complete military objectives before weather made further campaigning impossible. The shorter days meant less time for marching, and the cooling temperatures served as a constant reminder that armies needed to reach winter quarters before the worst weather arrived. The autumn harvest season provided opportunities for armies to acquire large quantities of food, but it also created competition with civilian populations who needed the same crops to survive the winter. This tension between military necessity and civilian survival created some of the most difficult moral challenges soldiers faced. Winter warfare, when it occurred, was perhaps the most challenging experience a soldier could face. The famous retreat from Moscow in 1812 represents the extreme end of winter campaigning, but even routine winter operations tested human endurance to its limits. Picture yourself trying to load and fire a musket with hands so cold you can barely feel your fingers, or attempting to march in formation across ice-covered ground where every step risks a fall that could result in injury or death. The psychological challenges of winter campaigning were as difficult as the physical ones. The short days and long nights, the constant cold, the difficulty of maintaining personal hygiene, and the challenges of finding adequate food all combined to create conditions that tested soldiers' mental health and morale. Yet soldiers developed remarkable adaptations to seasonal challenges. They learned to read weather signs with the skill of professional meteorologists, to modify their equipment and clothing for different conditions, and in an age before radio, telephone, or even reliable postal service, communication within Napoleon's army was both a marvel of organization and a source of constant frustration. Understanding how information moved through the military hierarchy and between scattered units provides insight into one of the most challenging aspects of 19th century military life. Picture yourself as a messenger, one of the most dangerous jobs in the army. You've been given orders that must reach a unit several miles away, through territory that may or may not be controlled by friendly forces. Your horse, if you're lucky enough to have one, is tired from the previous day's march, and you're carrying documents that could change the course of a battle if they arrive on time, or lose it if they don't. The system of military communication relied heavily on these individual messengers, men who rode between units carrying written orders, reports, and intelligence. These riders faced not just the normal hazards of travel, bad roads, harsh weather, mechanical problems with their horses, but also the constant danger of enemy patrols, bandits, and simple accidents that could leave critical messages undelivered. To ensure important messages got through, commanders often sent multiple messengers with the same information, hoping that at least one would reach his destination. This redundancy was expensive in terms of personnel and horses, but it was the only reliable way to ensure communication in an era without electronic backup systems. The writing of orders was an art form in itself. Military correspondence had to be clear enough to prevent misunderstanding, brief enough to be copied and transmitted quickly, but complete enough to provide subordinates with the information they needed to carry out their missions. A poorly written order could result in confusion, delay, or outright disaster. Soldiers who could read and write were valuable far beyond their military rank. They served as scribes for illiterate comrades, helped decode captured enemy documents, and often found themselves pressed into service as temporary messengers when regular communication systems broke down. The speed of communication was both faster and slower than you might expect. A message could travel as quickly as a horse could carry it, perhaps 50 miles in a day under good conditions. But weather, enemy action, or simple mechanical problems could delay messages for days or even weeks. Napoleon himself was famous for the speed of his decision-making, but even he had to work within the constraints of 19th century communication technology. Intelligence gathering was a constant activity that involved every soldier to some degree. Men were expected to observe and report anything unusual they saw during marches or while on guard duty. Local civilians were questioned about enemy movements, road conditions, and available supplies. Captured prisoners were interrogated for information about enemy plans and capabilities. The system of signals used by Napoleon's armies was surprisingly sophisticated. Flags, smoke signals, and even the position of arms and equipment could convey information across distances where shouting would be ineffective. Soldiers learned to read these signals as automatically as they followed verbal commands. But perhaps the most important form of communication was the informal network of rumors, gossip, and conversation that flowed through the army like water. Soldiers had an almost supernatural ability to sense changes in mood, morale, and circumstances throughout their units. This informal communication system could spread news of victory or defeat, changes in command, or shifts in strategic direction faster than official channels. Military culture in Napoleon's era was built around concepts of honor, duty, and brotherhood that were both inspiring and demanding. These weren't abstract ideals. They were practical codes of behavior that determined how soldiers treated each other, how they faced danger, and how they understood their place in the larger machinery of war. Picture yourself in a situation where your actions would be judged not just by their practical results, but by whether they upheld the honor of your regiment, your nation, and yourself as a soldier. This wasn't just peer pressure. It was a comprehensive worldview that touched every aspect of military life. The concept of regimental honor was particularly important. Each regiment had its own history, traditions, and reputation that every soldier was expected to uphold. Regiments that had distinguished themselves in famous battles carried their honors like family names, and new recruits were constantly reminded of the standards they were expected to meet. The shame of a regiment that performed poorly in battle could last for generations. Individual honor was equally important. A soldier's reputation for courage, reliability, and competence affected everything from his relationships with comrades to his chances for promotion. Men would take extraordinary risks to avoid being seen as cowards, and the bonds of mutual trust that developed between soldiers who had proven themselves in combat were stronger than most family relationships. But the honor code also had its dark sides. It could lead to unnecessary risks, prevent soldiers from seeking help when they needed it, and create rigid hierarchies that sometimes worked against military effectiveness. The pressure to appear brave could prevent soldiers from acknowledging fear, exhaustion, or illness until they became serious problems. The brotherhood among soldiers was both practical and emotional. Men who shared the hardships of military life developed relationships that lasted long after their service ended. Veterans of Napoleon's campaigns would gather for decades afterward to share stories, support each other through civilian difficulties, and maintain connections forged in the crucible of war. This brotherhood extended across national boundaries in ways that might seem surprising. French soldiers developed respect for Austrian opponents who fought bravely, German allies who shared their hardships, and even enemy soldiers who conducted themselves honorably. The shared experience of military life created bonds that sometimes transcended the political conflicts that had brought them together as enemies. The informal justice system that operated within military units was based largely on these concepts of honor and brotherhood. Soldiers who violated the trust of their comrades by stealing from them, abandoning them in danger, or failing to share hardships equally, faced punishment from their peers that could be more severe than official military discipline. But the honor code also created support systems that helped soldiers survive. Men who were wounded could count on their comrades to care for them. Those who lost their equipment in battle would find replacements provided by their tent mates. Soldiers who received letters or packages from home would share the contents with those who had no contact with their families. The rituals and ceremonies that marked military life served to reinforce these bonds and values. The formal parade where decorations were awarded, the evening roll call that accounted for every member of the unit, the shared meals around campfires, all of these served not just practical purposes, but helped maintain the culture that held the army together. Perhaps nowhere was the ingenuity of Napoleon's soldiers more evident than in their development of survival techniques that would impress modern outdoorsmen and survival experts. These weren't skills learned in training, they were techniques developed through necessity, passed down from veteran to recruit through the informal education system that operated within every military unit. Water procurement and purification was one of the most critical survival skills. Picture yourself approaching a stream that thousands of soldiers and horses have already used. The water is muddy, contaminated, and potentially deadly, but it's the only source available. Soldiers learn to dig shallow wells upstream from contaminated sources, to filter water through layers of cloth and sand, and to recognize the signs of water that was safe to drink versus water that would cause illness. They discovered that water stored in metal containers left in sunlight would often become safer to drink, an early understanding of solar disinfection that wouldn't be scientifically explained for another century. Veterans taught newcomers to add wine or vinegar to questionable water, not just for taste, but because the acidity helped kill harmful organisms. Fire making under adverse conditions was another essential skill. Soldiers learned to start fires in driving rain, heavy snow, and strong winds using techniques that required no matches, which didn't exist yet, and minimal dry tinder. They understood how to build fires that produced maximum heat with minimum smoke, fires that would burn all night with minimal tending, and fires that could be concealed from enemy observation. The construction of temporary shelters became an art form. Using nothing more than their military cloaks, some rope, and whatever natural materials were available, soldiers could construct shelters that provided protection from rain, wind, and cold. These weren't elaborate structures, but they could mean the difference between life and death during severe weather. Food preservation techniques developed by soldiers were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to smoke meat using techniques that required minimal equipment and fuel. They discovered methods of salt curing that could preserve food for weeks using salt scavenged from various sources. Some units even developed primitive fermentation techniques that could make spoiled vegetables safe to eat and actually improved their nutritional value. The medical knowledge that accumulated among veteran soldiers was extensive, if not always scientifically accurate. They learned to treat wounds using materials that were actually available rather than theoretical medical supplies. Tree bark could be used to treat fevers, certain plants could help with digestive problems, and honey, when available, was understood to help prevent wound infection. Soldiers developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining their equipment under field conditions. They learned to repair leather using animal fat and soot, to sharpen metal tools using stones found along the march route, and to waterproof cloth using various plant and animal materials. A soldier whose equipment failed was not just inconvenienced, he was potentially signing his own death warrant. The navigation skills that soldiers developed were remarkable considering they rarely had access to accurate maps or navigation instruments. They learned to read the landscape like a book, to use the sun and stars for direction, and to estimate distances and travel times with surprising accuracy. Veterans could often predict weather changes hours or even days in advance based on subtle environmental signs. Perhaps most importantly, soldiers learned to read people, both enemies and allies. They developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, to identify trustworthy civilians, and to recognize when someone was lying about local conditions or enemy positions. This human intelligence was often more valuable than any information gathered through formal reconnaissance. Living under the constant threat of death or injury created psychological adaptations that allowed soldiers to function in circumstances that would paralyze most civilians. Understanding how men coped with the daily reality that each morning might be their last provides insight into human resilience and the mental cost of military service. Picture yourself waking up each day not knowing whether you'll be marching peacefully through friendly territory or facing enemy fire before noon. This uncertainty wasn't occasional. It was the constant backdrop of military life. Soldiers developed mental strategies for coping with this stress that were both remarkable and sometimes troubling. Fatalism was one common adaptation. Many soldiers developed a philosophical acceptance that their survival was largely out of their control. This wasn't depression or giving up. It was a practical mental adjustment that allowed them to function despite constant danger. Men would often say that the bullet with their name on it would find them regardless of precautions, so there was no point in excessive worry. But this fatalism was balanced by an almost superstitious attention to routines and good luck charms that soldiers believed might improve their chances of survival. A particular way of putting on equipment, a lucky coin or button, a specific prayer or ritual before battle, these practices gave soldiers some sense of control over their fate, even if that control was largely illusory. The development of dark humor was another crucial psychological adaptation. Soldiers would joke about death, injury, and the absurdities of military life in ways that might seem callous to outsiders, but served essential mental health functions. This humor allowed them to acknowledge the reality of their situation without being overwhelmed by it. Soldiers also learned to compartmentalize their thinking in sophisticated ways. They could focus intensely on immediate practical concerns, loading a musket, maintaining formation, following orders, while pushing thoughts about larger consequences into mental compartments that could be dealt with later, if at all. The bonds between soldiers served crucial psychological functions beyond mere friendship. Having comrades who shared the same dangers and understood the same fears provided emotional support that was essential for mental survival. Men would talk through their anxieties with trusted friends, share techniques for managing fears, and provide encouragement during particularly difficult times. But the constant stress also took its toll in ways that military medicine of the era didn't understand. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was certainly present among Napoleon's soldiers, though it was often dismissed as cowardice or weakness. Men would suffer from nightmares, sudden panic, and inability to readjust to civilian life after their service ended. The letters that soldiers wrote home reveal fascinating insights into their psychological states. They would often present an optimistic picture to family members while privately struggling with fears and doubts. The act of writing these letters served as a form of therapy, allowing soldiers to maintain connections with the peaceful world they hoped to return to someday. Religious faith played a complex role in soldiers' psychological adaptation. Some men found great comfort in prayer and religious ritual, believing that divine protection might supplement their own efforts at survival. Others lost faith entirely when confronted with the apparent randomness of death and suffering. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, maintaining a complicated relationship with religion that helped them cope without requiring them to resolve theological contradictions. The phenomenon of combat veterans who seemed to thrive under dangerous conditions was also present in Napoleon's army. Some soldiers appeared to become addicted to the intensity and excitement of military life, finding civilian existence boring and purposeless after experiencing the heightened reality of war. These men often re-enlisted repeatedly, unable to adjust to peacetime life. The military hierarchy that governed Napoleon's army was both more rigid and more flexible than modern military structures. Understanding how authority, responsibility, and communication flowed through the chain of command reveals much about daily life for common soldiers and the remarkable organizational achievement that the Grande Armée represented. Picture yourself as a private soldier trying to understand your place in an organization that stretched from your immediate corporal all the way up to Napoleon himself. The distance between your daily reality and the strategic decisions that determined your fate was enormous, yet the system generally functioned with remarkable efficiency. Your immediate superior would be a corporal, probably a man not much different from yourself except for his experience and proven reliability. Corporals were typically promoted from the ranks based on their ability to read and write, their demonstrated courage under fire, and their skill at managing small groups of men. These were the leaders who had the most direct impact on your daily life, determining work assignments, settling disputes, and serving as the link between common soldiers and higher authority. Above the corporals were sergeants, men who had proven themselves capable of handling larger responsibilities. Sergeants were often responsible for entire companies during routine operations and served as the backbone of military organization. They combined the practical knowledge of former enlisted men with the authority to make decisions that affected dozens of soldiers. The officer class represented a significant social divide that was both bridged and reinforced by military service. Many officers came from aristocratic backgrounds and brought with them assumptions about class and social order that could create tension with common soldiers. But military necessity often forced these class distinctions to become less important than competence and leadership ability. Napoleon's practice of promoting officers based on merit rather than birth was revolutionary for its time, though it was never implemented as completely as legend suggests. The possibility that exceptional performance could lead to promotion through the ranks provided motivation for ambitious soldiers and helped create a more professional military culture. The relationship between officers and enlisted men was complex and varied greatly depending on individual personalities and circumstances. Some officers earned genuine respect and loyalty through their competence and concern for their men's welfare. Others maintained authority through fear and formal discipline, while still others proved themselves incompetent and lost the confidence of their subordinates. Communication up and down the chain of command required careful attention to military protocol and etiquette. A private soldier couldn't simply approach an officer with suggestions or complaints. Everything had to flow through proper channels, with each level of hierarchy serving as a filter and interpreter of information. But the system also provided opportunities for exceptional individuals to make their voices heard. Stories of common soldiers whose insights influenced major decisions were not uncommon, though they usually required the soldier to find an officer willing to listen and forward his ideas up the chain of command. The discipline system that maintained order within this hierarchy was harsh by modern standards, but was considered normal for the era. Punishments for military infractions ranged from extra duties and loss of pay to flogging, imprisonment, and in extreme cases, execution. The threat of these punishments was usually sufficient to maintain order, but their occasional implementation served as reminders of the consequences of challenging military authority. Yet, within this rigid system, there was also room for negotiation, persuasion, and informal influence. Experienced soldiers learned how to work within the system to achieve their goals, how to present requests in ways that were likely to be approved, and how to avoid the attention of officers who might create problems for them. Military life operated on schedules and routines that were designed to maximize efficiency and maintain order among large numbers of men. These routines, while often monotonous, provided structure and predictability that helped soldiers cope with the uncertainties of military life. Your day would begin before dawn with the sound of bugles or drums that served as the Army's alarm clock. There was no snooze button, no possibility of sleeping in. When the call came, every soldier was expected to be on his feet immediately. The speed with which you could transition from sleep to full alertness was a skill that developed with experience and could be crucial for survival. The morning routine was carefully choreographed to accomplish necessary tasks in minimum time. Personal hygiene, such as it was, had to be completed quickly. Equipment had to be inspected, cleaned, and packed. Breakfast, when available, was consumed rapidly while standing or walking. Roll call was a daily ritual that served multiple purposes beyond simply accounting for personnel. It was an opportunity for officers to assess the health and morale of their men, to pass along orders and information, and to maintain the discipline and unity that held military units together. Missing roll call without permission was a serious offense that could result in severe punishment. The middle portions of the day were filled with whatever activities the military situation demanded: marching, fighting, construction work, equipment maintenance, or training. But even these activities followed predictable patterns that soldiers learned to navigate efficiently. Meal times, when they occurred, were social events that provided brief respites from military discipline. Soldiers would gather in small groups to share whatever food was available, exchange news and gossip, and enjoy a few minutes of relatively relaxed conversation. These meals were often the highlight of the day, not just because of the food, but because of the human connection they provided. Evening routines were designed to prepare for the night and the following day. Equipment had to be cleaned and maintained, guards had to be posted, and preparations made for whatever the next day might bring. The transition from day-to-night activities was as carefully regulated as the morning wake-up. But within these official routines, soldiers developed their own informal schedules and rituals. Experienced men learned to use brief periods of free time efficiently, catching up on personal tasks, writing letters, or simply resting. They developed techniques for maintaining their equipment that went beyond official requirements, understanding that their lives might depend on the reliability of their gear. The weekly and monthly rhythms of military life provided longer-term structure. Certain days might be designated for major equipment maintenance, inspection by higher-ranking officers, or special training activities. These longer cycles helped prevent the monotony of daily routine from becoming completely overwhelming. Rest periods, when they occurred, were precious commodities that soldiers learned to maximize. The ability to fall asleep quickly under almost any conditions was a crucial survival skill. Veterans could sleep through noise that would wake civilians, catch brief naps during short breaks, and awaken instantly when necessary. If you're still with me on this journey through time, I hope you're finding these glimpses into daily life as fascinating as I do. The human capacity for adaptation and survival under difficult conditions is truly remarkable. And these soldiers developed skills and resilience that we can admire even from our comfortable modern perspective. Perhaps nothing distinguished Napoleon's soldiers more than their ability to improvise solutions to problems using whatever materials and resources were available. This wasn't just military engineering, it was a comprehensive approach to problem solving that touched every aspect of daily life. Picture yourself facing a problem that in our modern world would require a trip to a hardware store, a call to a specialist, or an online order. In Napoleon's army, You had to solve the problem using only what you could carry, find, or create from available materials. This constraint fostered an inventiveness that was remarkable even by the standards of the era. Clothing repair and modification was a constant necessity that turned every soldier into a tailor. Uniforms had to last for months or even years under conditions that would destroy modern clothing in weeks. Soldiers learned to patch holes using cloth from any available source. Enemy uniforms, civilian clothing, even canvas from abandoned tents. They became experts at darning socks, reinforcing seams, and modifying clothing to better suit their individual needs and local conditions. The modification of equipment was equally important. Standard issue gear was designed for average soldiers under typical conditions, but individual soldiers had to adapt their equipment to their specific circumstances. Musket straps were adjusted for comfort during long marches, knapsacks were modified to distribute weight more efficiently, and cooking equipment was customized to suit individual preferences and available food sources. Tool creation was a particularly impressive aspect of military improvisation. Soldiers learned to fashion serviceable tools from battlefield debris, broken equipment, and natural materials. A broken bayonet could become a knife, a damaged musket barrel could be turned into a cooking pot, and scrap metal could be forged into nails, hooks, or repair parts for other equipment. The creation of entertainment and comfort items showed the human side of this improvisation. Soldiers would carve chess pieces from wood, create musical instruments from scrap materials, and fashion games and toys that provided relief from the hardships of military life. These items served crucial morale functions and demonstrated that creativity and the human spirit could flourish even under harsh conditions. Medical improvisation was often a matter of life and death. Without access to proper medical supplies, soldiers learned to create bandages from any available cloth, to fashion splints from broken equipment, and to prepare medicinal preparations from plants and other natural materials. While much of this folk medicine was ineffective or even harmful by modern standards, some treatments were surprisingly sophisticated and effective. Shelter improvisation went far beyond the official tents and barracks provided by the army. Soldiers learned to create weatherproof shelters using their cloaks, branches, stones, and whatever other materials were available. These impromptu shelters could provide protection from rain, wind, and cold that meant the difference between survival and death during severe weather. The improvisation of cooking methods was particularly impressive. Soldiers learned to prepare edible meals using minimal equipment and whatever ingredients they could find. They developed techniques for cooking that required no pots or pans, methods for preserving food without refrigeration, and ways to make unpalatable rations more edible through creative preparation. Communication improvisation was essential when official systems broke down. Soldiers developed their own methods for sending messages, creating signals, and maintaining contact with scattered units. These improvised communication systems often proved more reliable than official channels during chaotic situations. The emotional reality of life in Napoleon's army was complex and often contradictory. Soldiers experienced fear and courage, despair and hope, isolation and brotherhood, often simultaneously. Understanding these emotional dynamics provides insight into the human cost of military service and the remarkable resilience of common soldiers. Picture yourself dealing with homesickness, so intense it felt like a physical pain. Letters from home were rare treasures that soldiers would read and reread until the paper wore thin. The emotional impact of these connections to family and civilian life was enormous, providing both comfort and increased longing for the world left behind. Fear was a constant companion that soldiers had to learn to manage rather than eliminate. The fear of death in battle was obvious, but there were many other fears that haunted military life. Fear of injury that would leave you helpless and dependent on others, fear of disease, fear of being separated from your unit and left alone in hostile territory, fear of disgracing yourself in front of your comrades. But soldiers also experienced emotions that civilians rarely understood. The intense bonding that developed between men who had shared extreme danger created relationships that were unlike anything in peacetime life. These friendships had an emotional intensity that could be as important as family relationships, sometimes more so. The pride that soldiers felt in their achievements and their units was another powerful emotion that helped sustain them through hardships. Men who had survived difficult campaigns, participated in famous battles, or served in distinguished regiments carried these accomplishments as sources of personal identity that lasted long after their military service ended. Anger was another significant emotion in military life. Soldiers felt anger at enemies who threatened them, at officers who made poor decisions, at civilians who didn't appreciate their sacrifices, and at the circumstances that had forced them into military service. Learning to channel this anger constructively rather than letting it become destructive was an important survival skill. The emotional impact of witnessing death suffering was something that every soldier had to process. Men watched friends die from disease, saw comrades killed in battle, and witnessed the destruction that war brought to civilian populations. These experiences left psychological scars that many soldiers carried for the rest of their lives. But soldiers also experienced positive emotions that were intensified by the extremity of their circumstances. The relief of surviving a battle, the joy of receiving news from home, the satisfaction of a successful mission. These emotions were heightened by contrast with the dangers and hardships of military life. The development of emotional resilience was perhaps the most important psychological adaptation soldiers made. They learned to recover from traumatic experiences, to maintain hope despite difficult circumstances, and to find meaning and purpose in lives that were often brutal and uncertain. The financial realities of military life in Napoleon's era created a complex web of formal and informal economic relationships that affected every aspect of daily existence. Understanding how soldiers manage their personal finances provides insight into both the practical challenges they faced and the creative solutions they developed. Your official pay as a soldier was modest and irregular, but it was supplemented by a variety of other income sources that required entrepreneurial thinking and careful management. Prize money from captured enemy equipment could provide significant windfalls, but it was unpredictable and had to be shared according to complex formulas that favored officers over enlisted men. The sale of personal services became an important source of additional income for many soldiers. Men who could read and write charged fees for writing letters for illiterate comrades. Those with medical knowledge earned money treating minor ailments. Soldiers who had been craftsmen in civilian life could use their skills to repair equipment or create needed items for other soldiers. Gambling was not just entertainment, it was a form of investment and risk management that could significantly impact a soldier's financial situation. Winners could accumulate resources that greatly improved their quality of life, while losers might find themselves dependent on the charity of their comrades for basic necessities. The trade in salvaged materials created an active secondary economy within the army. After battles, soldiers would collect anything of value from the battlefield: weapons, equipment, personal effects, even clothing that could be sold, traded, or repurposed. This scavenging was both practical necessity and economic opportunity. The relationship between soldiers and civilian populations involved complex economic exchanges that went beyond simple requisitioning. Soldiers would offer their labor for civilian projects, trade military equipment for food and supplies, and engage in various forms of barter that benefited both parties. Credit and debt relationships among soldiers created networks of financial obligation that could extend throughout entire units. Men would lend money to comrades in need, expecting repayment when circumstances improved. These informal banking systems operated without written contracts or legal enforcement, relying entirely on personal reputation and peer pressure. The cost of maintaining personal equipment was a significant financial burden that soldiers had to budget for carefully. Replacement clothing, repair materials, and additional equipment all had to be purchased from personal funds when official supplies were inadequate or unavailable. Soldiers in Napoleon's army developed their own philosophical understanding of war, military service, and their place in the larger historical events they were helping to shape. These weren't formal philosophical systems, but practical worldviews that helped men find meaning and purpose in lives that were often brutal and apparently senseless. Picture yourself trying to understand why you were fighting, what larger purpose your suffering served, and how your individual actions related to the grand strategies being developed by Napoleon and his generals. For most soldiers, these questions didn't have clear answers, but the search for meaning was an important part of psychological survival. Many soldiers developed a fatalistic acceptance of their circumstances that was both practical and philosophical. They understood that they had little control over the major events that shaped their lives, so they focused on the aspects of their situation that they could influence: their relationships with comrades, their personal conduct, and their immediate survival. The concept of duty provided a framework for understanding military service that transcended personal preferences and immediate self-interest. Soldiers who embraced this concept found meaning in fulfilling their obligations to their comrades, their units, and their country, regardless of whether they agreed with specific orders or strategic decisions. Honor, as understood by soldiers of this era, was both a personal and collective concept that provided standards for evaluating behavior and making difficult decisions. The desire to maintain personal honor and contribute to the honor of their units motivated soldiers to take risks and make sacrifices that would otherwise seem irrational. The brotherhood that developed among soldiers created its own moral framework that sometimes conflicted with official military law or civilian moral standards. Loyalty to comrades could override other considerations, leading soldiers to take actions that they justified by the unique circumstances of military life. Religious faith played a complex role in soldiers' philosophical understanding of their situation. Some men found comfort in believing that their service was part of a divine plan, while others lost faith when confronted with the apparent randomness of death and suffering in war. The relationship between individual soldiers and the larger historical forces they were part of was a source of both pride and bewilderment. Men understood that they were participating in events that would be remembered for generations, but they often had little understanding of the political and strategic factors that had brought them to their current circumstances. The weapons and equipment used by Napoleon's soldiers represented the cutting edge of early 19th century technology, but they would seem impossibly primitive by modern standards. Understanding how these tools worked and how soldiers learned to use them effectively reveals both the ingenuity of the era and the challenges soldiers faced in mastering their equipment. Your primary weapon, the musket, was a marvel of 18th century engineering that represented centuries of gradual improvement in firearms technology. But it was also a temperamental, inaccurate, and unreliable tool that required constant maintenance and considerable skill to use effectively. The smoothbore barrel meant that accuracy beyond about 50 yards was largely a matter of luck, and the complex loading procedure meant that rate of fire was severely limited. The bayonet transformed your musket from a firearm into a spear, but it also made the weapon awkward to handle and difficult to reload. The psychological impact of bayonet charges was often more important than their actual effectiveness in combat, as the sight of hundreds of men advancing with fixed bayonets could break enemy morale even before contact was made. Artillery pieces were the most sophisticated weapons on Napoleonic battlefields, representing the pinnacle of military technology for the era. Cannons could fire solid shot, explosive shells, or canister rounds that turned the gun into a giant shotgun. But they were also heavy, difficult to transport, and required teams of specially trained men to operate effectively. The equipment soldiers carried was designed for durability rather than comfort. Your knapsack, cartridge box, bayonet, and other gear were built to last for years of hard use, but they were also heavy and awkward. The total weight of a soldier's equipment could exceed 60 pounds, a significant burden during long marches. Communication technology was limited to messengers, signal flags, and various forms of visual and audible signals. The speed of communication was limited by the speed of horses, and the reliability of messages depended on the skill and courage of individual messengers who had to traverse dangerous territory to deliver their dispatches. Medical technology was primitive by modern standards, but it was advancing rapidly during the Napoleonic era. Military surgeons were developing new techniques for treating battle wounds, and the Army medical services were beginning to implement systematic approaches to battlefield medicine and hospital care. Transportation technology limited the speed and efficiency of military movements. Armies moved at the pace of marching infantry, and supply trains moved at the pace of horse-drawn wagons over roads that were often little more than dirt tracks. Weather conditions could completely halt military operations for days or weeks at a time. The engineering technology available to military units was basic, but effective. Soldiers learned to construct bridges, fortifications, and temporary buildings using hand tools and locally available materials. The speed and efficiency with which Napoleon's armies could overcome natural obstacles was legendary throughout Europe. Military operations in Napoleon's era were profoundly shaped by seasonal changes that determined not only when armies could move effectively, but also what types of operations were possible under different conditions. Understanding these seasonal rhythms provides insight into the natural constraints that shaped military strategy and the daily lives of soldiers. Spring brought the renewal of active campaigning after the enforced inactivity of winter quarters. Picture yourself emerging from months of relative comfort and routine into the uncertainty and excitement of a new campaign season. Your body would be soft from reduced activity, your equipment would need extensive preparation, and your unit would need time to regain the cohesion and efficiency that had developed during the previous year's operations. The spring roads were treacherous as winter snow melted and turned dirt tracks into rivers of mud. Armies had to wait for conditions to improve enough to allow the movement of artillery and supply wagons, creating a brief window of vulnerability when they were neither fully prepared for winter nor ready for summer operations. But spring also brought renewed opportunities for living off the land. Wild plants became edible again, providing nutrients that had been scarce during winter. Fresh meat became available as livestock emerged from winter shelter, and the longer days provided more time for both marching and foraging. Summer was the peak season for military operations, when armies could move quickly over dry roads and soldiers could sleep in the open without risk of freezing. But summer brought its own challenges, particularly the constant search for adequate water supplies for men and horses. The dust created by thousands of marching feet was a constant torment during dry summer weather. Picture yourself marching in a column that stretched for miles, breathing air thick with dust kicked up by the soldiers ahead of you. This dust got into everything: food, equipment, clothing, and created respiratory problems that could be as debilitating as enemy action. Heat-related illnesses were constant dangers during summer campaigns. Soldiers wore wool uniforms designed for European climates, and the combination of heavy clothing, equipment, and hot weather could be deadly. Experienced soldiers learned techniques for managing heat stress, conserving water, and recognizing the early signs of heat exhaustion in themselves and their comrades. Fall campaigns had a particular urgency because everyone knew that winter was approaching. There was often a race against time to complete military objectives before weather made further operations impossible. The shorter days meant less time for marching, and the cooling temperatures served as constant reminders that armies needed to reach winter quarters before the worst weather arrived. The autumn harvest provided opportunities for armies to acquire large quantities of fresh food, but it also created competition with civilian populations who needed the same crops to survive the winter. This tension between military necessity and civilian survival created some of the most difficult moral challenges soldiers faced. Winter operations, when they occurred, represented the ultimate test of military endurance and organization. The famous retreat from Moscow represents the extreme end of winter campaigning, but even routine winter operations tested human endurance to its limits. Take a moment to imagine loading and firing a musket with hands so cold you can barely feel your fingers, or trying to maintain formation while marching across ice-covered ground where every step risks a fall that could result in injury or death. The physical and mental endurance required for military service in Napoleon's era was extraordinary by modern standards. Soldiers developed capabilities that would impress modern athletes and survival experts, but they paid a price in health and longevity that was accepted as a normal part of military life. Your cardiovascular fitness would have been developed through necessity rather than systematic training. The daily marches, often covering 15 to 20 miles while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, created a level of aerobic conditioning that few modern people achieve. But this fitness came at the cost of joint damage, foot problems, and other orthopedic issues that would plague veterans for the rest of their lives. The ability to function on minimal sleep was a crucial survival skill that soldiers developed through necessity rather than choice. During active campaigns, you might get only a few hours of sleep per night for weeks at a time. Veterans learned to catch brief naps whenever opportunities arose and to remain alert and functional despite chronic sleep deprivation. Nutritional endurance was perhaps even more challenging than physical endurance. Soldiers learned to function effectively while consuming diets that were inadequate in both quantity and quality. The ability to maintain strength and health while eating irregularly and poorly was a skill that some men never mastered, leading to illness, injury, and sometimes death. Mental endurance was equally important and perhaps more difficult to develop. The constant stress of potential danger, the uncertainty about the future, and the emotional trauma of witnessing death and suffering required psychological resilience that not everyone possessed. Soldiers who thrived in military environments often had personality traits that allowed them to compartmentalize stress and maintain optimism despite difficult circumstances. The endurance required for specific military activities was specialized and impressive. Loading and firing a musket repeatedly during battle required not just technical skill, but also the physical stamina to continue functioning while exhausted, frightened, and possibly wounded. The muscle memory and mental focus required for these tasks had to be developed through extensive practice and maintained through constant repetition. Social endurance. The ability to live in close quarters with the same group of men for months or years at a time was another crucial skill that determined military effectiveness. Soldiers had to learn to manage interpersonal conflicts, maintain morale during difficult periods, and preserve unit cohesion despite personality conflicts and cultural differences. The recovery abilities that soldiers developed were as important as their endurance capabilities. Veterans learned to recuperate quickly from physical exertion, to bounce back from minor illnesses and injuries, and to maintain their effectiveness despite the accumulated wear and tear of military service. The relationships that developed between soldiers in Napoleon's army were unlike anything most of them had experienced in civilian life. These bonds were forged through shared hardship, mutual dependence, and the constant awareness that survival often depended on the reliability and courage of the men around you. Picture yourself in a situation where your life literally depends on the actions of men you might never have chosen as friends under normal circumstances. The wealthy merchant's son from Paris, the peasant farmer from Bavaria, the former priest from Italy. Circumstances have thrown you together and created relationships that transcend the social barriers that would have separated you in civilian life. These friendships were intensified by the extremity of military life in ways that peaceful relationships rarely match. When you've shared your last piece of bread with a comrade, when you've carried a wounded friend to safety under enemy fire, when you've stayed awake through a cold night so that an exhausted tent mate could sleep, these experiences create bonds that often lasted for the rest of men's lives. The informal support systems that developed within military units were essential for survival. Men would pool resources during times of scarcity, share skills and knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death, and provide emotional support during the psychological challenges of military service. But these relationships also had their complications and tensions. The stress of military life, the competition for limited resources, and the personality conflicts that inevitably arose when men lived in close quarters could create feuds and animosities that were as intense as the friendships. The hierarchies within these friendship groups were complex and often had little to do with military rank. Veterans were respected, regardless of their official positions. Men who had proven themselves in combat earned influence that couldn't be taken away, and those who consistently showed courage and reliability found themselves looked to for leadership even if they held no formal authority. The codes of behavior that governed these relationships were unwritten but universally understood. Loyalty to your comrades took precedence over almost everything else. Sharing hardships equally was expected. Courage in the face of danger was demanded. Failure to live up to these standards could result in social isolation that made military life almost unbearable. The process of integrating new members into these established groups was carefully managed by veteran soldiers who understood that unit cohesion was essential for survival. Newcomers were tested, evaluated, and gradually accepted based on their demonstrated reliability and willingness to embrace the values of military brotherhood. Women occasionally played roles in these masculine communities, usually as camp followers, who provided services ranging from laundry and cooking to nursing and companionship. These women often developed their own relationships with military units that could last for years and provided a connection to civilian life that was psychologically important for many soldiers. Soldiers in Napoleon's army were conscious that they were participating in events that would be remembered and studied for generations. This awareness of their historical significance affected how they understood their service and provided a sense of purpose that helped many men endure the hardships of military life. Picture yourself realizing that the battles you were fighting, the campaigns you were participating in, and the leaders you were serving under would be discussed in history books for centuries to come. This knowledge brought both pride and pressure. Pride in being part of something significant, but pressure to live up to the standards that history would expect of Napoleon's soldiers. The veterans who had served in the early campaigns of the Revolution and the Empire carried stories that had already become legendary within the army. These men were living links to the great victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, and their presence in the ranks provided both inspiration and a standard of excellence that newer soldiers strive to match. The songs, stories, and traditions that developed within the army became part of a cultural legacy that soldiers understood they were helping to create. The ballads sung around campfires, the tales of heroism and sacrifice, the customs and rituals that marked military life, all of these would be passed down to future generations of soldiers and would help shape the military culture of Europe for decades to come. Individual soldiers often struggled with the gap between their personal experiences and the grand historical narrative they were part of. While generals and politicians spoke of glory, honor, and national destiny, common soldiers dealt with hunger, cold, disease, and the constant threat of death. Learning to reconcile these two perspectives was an important part of the psychological adjustment to military life. The letters and memoirs that soldiers wrote during their service provide fascinating glimpses into how ordinary men understood their role in extraordinary events. Many soldiers expressed amazement at finding themselves present at famous battles, serving under legendary commanders, and participating in campaigns that were reshaping the map of Europe. But the weight of history could also be oppressive. Soldiers were expected to maintain standards of courage and conduct that had been established by their predecessors, and the fear of disappointing these expectations could be as stressful as the fear of enemy action. The awareness that their actions would be judged by future generations influenced how soldiers conducted themselves, both in battle and in their treatment of civilians and prisoners. The knowledge that their behavior reflected not just on themselves, but on their units, their army, and their nation, created a sense of responsibility that went far beyond military discipline. Napoleon's army was not just a collection of armed men. It was a complex organizational machine that required intricate coordination between different types of units, each with specialized functions and capabilities. Understanding how these different components work together provides insight into one of the most sophisticated military organizations in history. Picture yourself as part of an infantry regiment, but understanding that your effectiveness depended on coordination with artillery units, cavalry squadrons, engineers, medical corps, and supply trains. Each of these components had its own culture, traditions, and methods of operation, but they all had to work together seamlessly during combat operations. The infantry formed the backbone of Napoleon's army, but infantry tactics required careful coordination between different types of foot soldiers. Line infantry formed the main battle formations, using their muskets to deliver massed volleys of fire. Light infantry served as skirmishers, operating in loose formations to harass enemy forces and provide reconnaissance. Grenadiers were elite infantry units that served as shock troops for particularly difficult missions. Artillery was perhaps the most technically sophisticated branch of Napoleon's army. Cannon crews required extensive training to operate their weapons effectively, and the coordination between different types of artillery, field guns, howitzers, mortars, required mathematical precision and careful timing. The famous Grand Battery tactics that Napoleon used in major battles involved concentrating dozens of cannons to create overwhelming firepower at crucial points. Cavalry units provided mobility and shock action that could decisively influence battle outcomes. Heavy cavalry, mounted on large horses and equipped with armor and swords, could break enemy infantry formations through the sheer weight of their charge. Light cavalry served as scouts, messengers, and pursuit forces that could exploit victory or cover retreat. The engineering corps was responsible for the technical aspects of military operations that required specialized knowledge. They built bridges, constructed fortifications, conducted sieges, and solved the logistical problems that could stop entire armies in their tracks. These men were often drawn from civilian backgrounds in construction and technical trades. The medical corps represented one of the most innovative aspects of Napoleon's military organization. Military medicine was advancing rapidly during this period, and Napoleon's armies included some of the most skilled surgeons and medical administrators in Europe. The development of systematic approaches to battlefield medicine and hospital care saved thousands of lives and helped maintain army effectiveness. Supply and logistics units were perhaps the least glamorous but most essential components of the military machine. These men were responsible for feeding, equipping, and maintaining armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The organizational challenges they faced were staggering, and their success or failure often determined the outcome of entire campaigns. The coordination between these different branches required communication systems, command structures, and operational procedures that were remarkably advanced for the early 19th century. The ability to coordinate the movements of diverse units across vast distances, often under combat conditions, represented one of the greatest organizational achievements of the era. The human cost of military service in Napoleon's army was enormous, extending far beyond the battlefield casualties that dominated contemporary accounts. Understanding the full price that soldiers paid for their service provides sobering perspective on the realities of military life in this era. Picture yourself trying to calculate the true cost of your military service, not just the risk of death or injury in battle, but the accumulated toll on your health, your relationships, your economic prospects, and your psychological well-being. For most soldiers, military service meant sacrificing years of their lives to an institution that would use them up and discard them with little concern for their future welfare. The physical toll of military life was severe and often permanent. The constant marching, poor nutrition, exposure to harsh weather, and inadequate medical care left most veterans with health problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Joint problems, respiratory ailments, digestive disorders, and chronic pain were almost universal among men who had served for extended periods. Disease killed far more soldiers than enemy action. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and other illnesses swept through military camps with devastating effect. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition that characterized military life created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. The psychological cost of military service was equally severe, though it was poorly understood at the time. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was common among veterans, who often struggled with nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Many former soldiers turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to cope with psychological trauma. The economic impact of military service was often catastrophic for soldiers and their families. Men who spent years in the army lost opportunities for career development, skill acquisition, and wealth accumulation that were available to their civilian contemporaries. Military pay was low and irregular, and many soldiers returned home to find themselves economically disadvantaged compared to men who had avoided military service. Family relationships suffered enormously from extended military service. Marriages failed under the strain of long separations, children grew up without knowing their fathers, and many soldiers found it difficult to reconnect with family members who had adapted to life without them. The social cost of military service varied depending on how wars ended and how veterans were treated by their societies. Soldiers who served in victorious armies might be welcomed home as heroes, but those who served in failed campaigns could face blame and social rejection. Veterans often found that civilian society had little understanding or patience for the problems they faced in readjusting to peacetime life. But soldiers also gained things from their military service that had value despite the costs. The bonds formed with fellow soldiers often lasted lifetimes and provided support networks that could be crucial during difficult times. Military service provided education and experience that some men could parlay into successful civilian careers. Veterans carried skills, knowledge, and perspectives that set them apart from their civilian contemporaries. The sense of having participated in significant historical events was a source of pride that many veterans carried throughout their lives. Despite the hardships they had endured, many former soldiers looked back on their military service as the most meaningful period of their lives, when they had been part of something larger than themselves and had tested their courage and capabilities under extreme conditions. As our journey through the life of Napoleon's soldier draws toward its close, let us walk together one final time down the dusty roads of early 19th century Europe. Picture yourself as the sun begins to set on what might have been your last day in uniform, your last day carrying the musket that had become as familiar as your own arm. Your last day marching in formation with men who had become closer than brothers. The evening light filters through the trees alongside the road, casting long shadows that dance and flicker as your regiment moves toward what everyone hopes will be winter quarters, toward rest, toward the possibility of peace. Your feet, so accustomed now to the rhythm of the march that they continue moving almost without conscious thought, carry you forward through landscapes that have witnessed the passage of countless armies and cut the dreams and fears of countless soldiers like yourself. Behind you stretches the road you've traveled, not just the physical miles covered during this day's march, but the entire journey of military service that has transformed you from the person you were into the person you've become. You've learned things about yourself that you never could have discovered in peacetime. How much hunger you can endure while still functioning, how little sleep you can survive on, how much fear you can feel and still move forward, how deep the bonds of friendship can go when forged in the crucible of shared danger. The equipment you carry has become so familiar that you barely notice its weight anymore. Your musket, once awkward and foreign, now feels like an extension of your body. Your knapsack, packed with the accumulated wisdom of months or years of campaign life, contains everything you need to survive another day, another week, another season of military life. Around you, your comrades march with the same steady rhythm, each lost in his own thoughts as the day winds down. Some are probably thinking of home, of families they haven't seen in months or years, of lives they left behind and wonder if they'll ever return to. Others might be focused on more immediate concerns, the rumored arrival of supply wagons, the possibility of finding better quarters for the night, the hope that tomorrow's march will be shorter than today's. If you're finding peace in this journey through history, I'd encourage you to let that feeling of calm settle over you. There's something profoundly restful about understanding how people before us faced their challenges with courage, ingenuity, and an indomitable human spirit that transcends the centuries. The conversations around you are muted now, soldiers saving their energy for the final miles of the day's march. But you can hear fragments, someone sharing news from a letter received days ago, another man describing a technique for waterproofing boots that he learned from a veteran, the quiet singing of a ballad that has become popular throughout the army. These sounds, these voices, represent one of the most remarkable aspects of your military experience. The way that men from different countries, different social classes, different backgrounds have been forged into a community by shared hardship and common purpose. The wealthy merchant's son from Paris has learned to value the practical wisdom of the peasant farmer from Bavaria. The former priest from Italy has found friendship with the young nobleman from Poland. Military service has broken down barriers and created relationships that would have been impossible in civilian society. As the light continues to fade, you begin to see the smoke of cooking fires in the distance, the evening encampment where your regiment will spend the night. The prospect of rest, of a hot meal if supplies have arrived, of a few hours to tend to your equipment and perhaps write a letter home brings a small surge of energy to your tired muscles. The encampment, when you reach it, is a temporary city that will exist for one night and then vanish, leaving barely a trace of the thousands of men who called it home. But for tonight, it represents security, community, and the simple pleasure of being able to stop walking and put down the burdens you've carried throughout the day. You find your assigned place in the orderly chaos of the camp, stack your musket with those of your tent mates, and begin the evening routine that has become as automatic as breathing. Equipment must be cleaned and checked, rations must be prepared and consumed, guards must be posted, and preparations made for tomorrow's continuation of the endless march. But tonight, as you settle into whatever sleeping arrangements you've managed to create, you might reflect on the extraordinary nature of the life you've been living. You've been part of one of the most remarkable military organizations in history, serving under commanders whose names will be remembered for centuries, participating in events that have reshaped the political landscape of Europe. You've learned to survive under conditions that would challenge the strongest and most resourceful people of any era. You've developed skills, both practical and psychological, that have prepared you to face whatever challenges life might bring. You've formed relationships and gained experiences that will influence the rest of your life, whether that life continues in military service or eventually returns to civilian pursuits. The sounds of the camp settling in for the night create a familiar symphony. The quiet conversations of men sharing the day's experiences, the crackling of dying fires, the occasional challenge of sentries posted around the perimeter, the distant sound of horses being tended by cavalry units. These sounds have become the lullaby of military life, as comforting in their familiarity as they once were frightening in their strangeness. As sleep begins to claim you, your mind might wander to thoughts of home, of the life you left behind and the life you hope to return to someday. You might think about the stories you'll tell if anyone cares to listen, about the places you've seen and the things you've done. You might wonder whether the people at home will understand what you've been through, whether they'll be able to appreciate the person you've become. But perhaps more likely, you'll simply sink into the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion, your body and mind finally able to rest after another day of challenges met and obstacles overcome. Tomorrow will bring new demands, new hardships, new opportunities to test your courage and resourcefulness. But tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that you've survived another day as a soldier in Napoleon's army, and that's an accomplishment that no one can take away from you. The camp grows quiet around you as thousands of men seek their own rest, each carrying his own memories of the day, his own hopes for tomorrow, his own understanding of what it means to be a soldier in an age when armies could reshape the destiny of nations and individual courage could echo through the centuries. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can find some measure of peace in knowing that you've been part of something larger than yourself, that your individual struggle and sacrifice has contributed to a story that will be told and retold for generations to come. The road stretches on ahead, as it always has and always will for soldiers in every age. But tonight you can rest, knowing that you've walked it with honor, with courage, and with the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood that make even the hardest march bearable. In the multinational army that was Napoleon's Grande Armée, communication transcended the barriers of language through necessity, creating a unique military dialect that blended French commands with German efficiency Italian passion, and Polish determination. Picture yourself learning not just the formal language of military orders, but the rich patois of campaign life that developed wherever soldiers from different nations found themselves sharing the same hardships. Your daily vocabulary would expand to include essential words in half a dozen languages: the German warning for incoming artillery, the Italian expression for sharing food, the Polish curse that somehow perfectly captured the frustration of broken equipment. These weren't learned in classrooms, but acquired through the urgent need to communicate with the men whose actions might determine your survival. The formal language of military command was primarily French, reflecting Napoleon's origins and the dominance of French military culture throughout the army. But within this framework, regional variations and local adaptations created a linguistic landscape as diverse as the empire itself. Orders filtered down through the ranks would be translated, interpreted, and sometimes completely transformed as they passed from French officers to German sergeants to Italian corporals to Polish privates. Written communication faced even greater challenges. Most soldiers were illiterate, and those who could read often knew only their native languages. This created opportunities for the educated minority who could serve as translators, scribes, and interpreters. These men found themselves invaluable not just for official communications, but for the personal letters that meant so much to homesick soldiers. The development of military slang was a constant process that reflected the experiences unique to campaign life. New words emerged for concepts that had no civilian equivalent: specific types of hunger, particular varieties of mud, the exact feeling of exhaustion that came after a 20-mile march in the rain. This specialized vocabulary created bonds among veterans who had shared these experiences and helped distinguish seasoned soldiers from raw recruits. Songs played a crucial role in language transmission throughout the army. Ballads that began in one unit would spread throughout entire corps, carrying with them phrases, expressions, and cultural references that would be adopted and adapted by soldiers who might not even speak the original language. These songs served as vehicles for unofficial news, complaints about officers, and expressions of homesickness that could be safely shared through humor and metaphor. The medical terminology that soldiers learned was particularly important, as the ability to describe symptoms and injuries could literally mean the difference between life and death. Veterans became surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of military medicine, learning to distinguish between different types of fevers, to describe wounds with precision, and to communicate medical needs to overworked surgeons who might not share their native language. Gambling created its own international language, as soldiers developed systems for betting and gaming that transcended linguistic barriers. Card games, dice, and various forms of wagering provided entertainment and economic opportunity, but they also required complex communication about rules, stakes, and outcomes that had to be understood by men from vastly different cultural backgrounds. The language of food and cooking was perhaps the most enthusiastically shared aspect of military linguistics. Soldiers eagerly learned words for different types of preparation, ingredients, and cooking techniques from their comrades. A German soldier might teach French troops the word for a particular type of sausage, while an Italian would share terms for pasta preparation that would be adopted by men who had never seen Italy. Profanity, as might be expected, was one of the first aspects of foreign languages that soldiers mastered. The ability to curse effectively in multiple languages was considered a mark of experience and sophistication. These expressions often carried subtle cultural meanings that reflected different national attitudes toward authority, suffering, and the absurdities of military life. The regional dialects within each national group added another layer of complexity to military communication. A Bavarian and a Prussian might both be considered Germans by their French comrades, but they could have as much difficulty understanding each other as they would communicating with Italians. This created a constant process of linguistic adaptation and mutual education that enriched the cultural life of the army. Technical military terminology required particular attention, as misunderstandings about weapons, tactics, or engineering could have deadly consequences. Artillery crews developed a specialized vocabulary that had to be understood precisely by men from different backgrounds who worked together to operate complex equipment under dangerous conditions. The names and nicknames that soldiers gave to their officers, their equipment, and their enemies reflected both linguistic creativity and cultural attitudes. These informal appellations often spread throughout entire armies, creating a shared vocabulary of irreverence and humor that helped soldiers maintain morale under difficult circumstances. The routines that governed daily life in Napoleon's army were more than mere military discipline. They were carefully evolved systems of survival that had been tested by generations of soldiers and refined through the bitter experience of campaign life. Picture yourself learning not just what to do, but why each action mattered, how each routine contributed to your ability to survive another day in an environment that was constantly trying to kill you. Your morning ablutions, such as they were, followed a precise sequence designed to prepare you for whatever the day might bring. The brief washing with whatever water was available wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about checking your body for signs of disease, injury, or infection that could worsen if ignored. Veterans taught newcomers to examine their feet carefully each morning, looking for the early signs of problems that could leave a man unable to march. The ritual of checking and cleaning your musket each morning was perhaps the most important survival routine you'd learn. This wasn't just about military discipline. Your life depended on your weapon functioning properly when needed. The process of disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling your musket became as automatic as breathing, performed even when you were exhausted, sick, or under fire. Equipment inspection followed patterns that had been developed through hard experience. Each piece of gear had to be checked, not just for obvious damage, but for the subtle signs of wear that could lead to failure at crucial moments. The straps that held your knapsack, the buckles on your cartridge box, the stitching on your shoes, all had to be examined and maintained with the understanding that equipment failure in the field could be a death sentence. Food preparation, when ingredients were available, followed rituals that maximized both nutrition and safety. Soldiers learned to cook not just for taste, but for survival, understanding which techniques would kill harmful organisms, which combinations of ingredients would provide necessary nutrients, and which methods of preparation would make even spoiled foods safe to consume. The evening routines were equally important and more complex. Setting up camp wasn't just about finding a place to sleep. It was about creating defensive positions, establishing fields of fire, and organizing the hundreds of details that would determine whether the unit would be ready to fight if attacked during the night. Guard duty rotations followed ancient patterns that balanced the need for security with the necessity of allowing men to rest. The rituals of challenging unknown figures in the darkness, of maintaining alertness during long hours of watching, and of passing information between relief guards were refined through centuries of military experience. Personal hygiene routines had to be adapted to the realities of campaign life while still serving their essential health functions. Soldiers learned to maintain cleanliness with minimal water, to prevent infestations of lice and other parasites, and to recognize the early signs of diseases that could spread rapidly through military units. The maintenance of personal possessions followed careful routines designed to make the most of limited resources. Clothing had to be repaired, modified, and preserved with materials that were constantly in short supply. Every scrap of cloth, every piece of thread, every button had value and had to be conserved and used wisely. Letter writing, when materials were available, followed its own rituals and conventions. Soldiers learned to write messages that would pass military censorship while still conveying meaningful information to family members. They developed techniques for making limited writing materials last as long as possible and for ensuring that precious letters would survive the rigors of military mail systems. The sharing of resources within military units followed unwritten but universally understood protocols. Men learned when and how to ask for help, when to offer assistance to others, and how to maintain the delicate balance of mutual support that kept units functioning effectively. Money management required its own set of survival routines. Soldiers learned to hide their valuables, to manage irregular pay, and to participate in the informal economies that operated within military units. The ability to save, trade, and invest limited resources could mean the difference between mere survival and relative comfort. In Napoleon's army, knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival itself. The accumulated wisdom of veteran soldiers represented a treasure trove of practical information that could mean the difference between life and death for new recruits. Picture yourself as a newcomer, eager to learn from men whose scars and weathered faces told stories of campaigns across Europe and lessons learned through bitter experience. The veterans who had survived multiple campaigns possessed knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual or learned in any training program. They knew which types of clouds meant rain was coming, which sounds indicated friendly versus enemy artillery, and which officers could be trusted to make good decisions under pressure. This knowledge was passed down through an informal education system that operated wherever experienced soldiers gathered with newer recruits. Weather prediction was one of the most valuable skills that veterans could teach. The ability to read atmospheric signs could help soldiers prepare for storms, find shelter before severe weather hit, and make decisions about equipment and clothing that could prevent illness or injury. Old soldiers could predict weather changes hours or even days in advance, using signs that were invisible to inexperienced eyes. The identification of edible plants was another crucial skill that could supplement inadequate rations and prevent starvation during long campaigns. Veterans knew which roots could be eaten raw, which leaves could be boiled into nutritious broths, and which fruits and nuts could be safely consumed. This botanical knowledge had been accumulated through trial and error, sometimes fatal error, by generations of foraging soldiers. Medical knowledge among veterans was extensive and often surprisingly accurate. They knew which herbs could reduce fever, which poultices could prevent wound infection, and which symptoms indicated serious diseases that required immediate attention. While much of this folk medicine was ineffective by modern standards, some treatments were remarkably sophisticated and could indeed save lives. The psychology of combat was another area where veteran wisdom proved invaluable. Experienced soldiers could teach newcomers how to manage fear, how to function effectively under fire, and how to recognize the signs of battle exhaustion in themselves and their comrades. They understood the mental techniques that could help men maintain courage and effectiveness in the face of overwhelming danger. Equipment modification and repair techniques developed by veterans often exceeded the capabilities of official military supply systems. They knew how to waterproof leather using animal fat and charcoal, how to repair metal tools using field-expedient techniques, and how to modify standard equipment to suit individual needs and local conditions. The social dynamics of military life were complex subjects that veterans understood instinctively. They knew which officers were competent and which were dangerous, which regulations could be safely ignored, and which had to be followed strictly, and how to navigate the informal hierarchies that operated within military units. Navigation skills developed by experienced soldiers were remarkably sophisticated. They could determine direction using the sun and stars, estimate distances and travel times with surprising accuracy, and read terrain features that could indicate water sources, enemy positions, or safe routes of travel. The timing of various activities was another area where veteran wisdom proved crucial. Experienced soldiers knew when to gather firewood, when to fill water containers, and when to prepare for potential enemy action. They understood the rhythms of military life that could help men stay one step ahead of disaster. Communication techniques that had been developed through years of campaign experience could help soldiers maintain contact with their units, send messages through dangerous territory, and gather intelligence from civilian populations. Veterans knew how to read people, how to ask questions that would yield useful information, and how to avoid situations that could lead to unnecessary danger. The preservation of morale was perhaps the most important skill that veterans possessed. They knew how to maintain hope during difficult periods, how to find humor in desperate situations, and how to keep units functioning effectively even when official leadership failed. This psychological wisdom was often more valuable than any technical knowledge they could impart. Financial survival techniques were another area where veteran experience proved invaluable. Experienced soldiers knew how to manage irregular pay, how to participate in informal economies, and how to save and invest limited resources. They understood the economic realities of military life and could teach newcomers how to avoid the financial pitfalls that trapped many soldiers. Religion in Napoleon's army was a complex tapestry woven from Catholic traditions, Protestant reforms, folk beliefs, and the practical atheism that often emerged from witnessing too much suffering and death. Picture yourself grappling with questions of faith and meaning while surrounded by the daily evidence that the universe might be indifferent to human suffering and prayer. The formal religious observances that had structured civilian life became difficult to maintain under campaign conditions. Sunday services were often impossible when armies were on the march, and the lack of proper churches, qualified clergy, and religious materials forced soldiers to adapt their spiritual practices to military realities. Field chaplains attempted to provide religious guidance and comfort, but they were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of men under their care and the practical difficulties of conducting services under field conditions. These dedicated men tried to maintain religious traditions while adapting to the unique challenges of ministering to soldiers who faced death on a daily basis. Personal prayer and devotion took on new meaning for men who understood that each day might be their last. Soldiers developed their own forms of spiritual practice that could be maintained under any conditions. Brief prayers before battle, moments of gratitude for survival, and quiet reflection during the rare, peaceful interludes that campaign life provided. The role of religious artifacts and talismans was significant throughout the army. Men carried crosses, medals, prayer books, and other sacred objects that provided psychological comfort and spiritual connection. These items often became more precious than gold to soldiers who had little else to connect them to their spiritual traditions and family heritage. Different religious traditions within the multinational army created opportunities for spiritual exchange and sometimes conflict. Catholic soldiers from France might find themselves serving alongside Protestant Germans, Orthodox Russians, or Jewish merchants who had been pressed into military service. These encounters challenged traditional religious boundaries and sometimes led to broader spiritual understanding. The treatment of enemy dead and civilian populations raised moral questions that many soldiers struggled to reconcile with their religious beliefs. The necessities of war often required actions that contradicted religious teachings about the sanctity of life and the treatment of fellow human beings. Superstitions and folk beliefs flourished alongside formal religious practices. Soldiers developed elaborate systems of good luck charms, protective rituals, and supernatural beliefs that helped them cope with the uncertainties and dangers of military life. These practices often blended Christian symbolism with older folk traditions and new superstitions born from campaign experience. The question of divine justice was particularly troubling for soldiers who witnessed good men die while evil ones survived, who saw innocent civilians suffer while corrupt officers prospered, and who participated in actions that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about morality and righteousness. Many soldiers experienced what modern psychology would recognize as a crisis of faith. The cognitive dissonance between religious teachings about love, mercy, and peace and the daily realities of military violence could lead to profound spiritual questioning that lasted long after military service ended. Some men found that military service strengthened their faith by providing evidence of divine protection, miraculous survival, and the power of prayer under extreme conditions. They interpreted their survival as evidence of divine favor and their experiences as tests that had strengthened their spiritual character. Others lost faith entirely, concluding that the apparent randomness of death and suffering proved that either God didn't exist or didn't care about human affairs. These men often developed philosophical approaches to life that emphasized human solidarity and practical ethics rather than religious doctrine. The role of confession and absolution was particularly important for Catholic soldiers who faced the possibility of death in battle. Military chaplains often found themselves overwhelmed by soldiers seeking spiritual preparation for combat, and the traditional requirements for proper confession had to be adapted to military realities. Religious holidays and observances had to be modified to fit military schedules and conditions. Christmas, Easter, and other significant dates might be acknowledged with brief ceremonies or simple observances that maintain spiritual connections while acknowledging the practical limitations of campaign life. The burial of the dead raised complex religious questions that had to be balanced against military necessities. Proper religious funeral rites were often impossible under combat conditions, forcing soldiers to develop alternative ways of honoring their fallen comrades while maintaining their own spiritual equilibrium. The financial machinery that supported Napoleon's military campaigns was a complex system that connected individual soldiers to international banking, imperial taxation, and the economic transformation of Europe. Picture yourself as a small cog in this vast economic engine, understanding that your daily bread depended on financial decisions made in Paris, Vienna, and London by men who would never shoulder a musket or sleep in a muddy field. Your monthly pay, when it arrived at all, represented just one small part of an economic system that had to feed, equip, and transport hundreds of thousands of men across thousands of miles. The mathematics of military supply were staggering. Each soldier required approximately 2 pounds of bread per day, along with meat, wine, and other necessities that had to be purchased, transported, and distributed under conditions that would challenge modern logistics systems. The currency you received might be French francs, Austrian thalers, Prussian groschen, or any of dozens of other monetary systems, depending on what territory your army currently occupied and what financial arrangements had been made with local authorities. Soldiers had to become experts in exchange rates, currency evaluation, and the complex negotiations required to convert military pay into useful goods and services. Local economies were transformed by the passage of armies in ways that affected every aspect of civilian life. The sudden appearance of tens of thousands of potential customers could create boom conditions for local merchants, but it could also lead to inflation, shortage, and economic disruption that lasted long after the armies moved on. The requisition system that supplied armies created its own economic relationships that blended legal obligation with practical negotiation. Local authorities were required to provide specified quantities of food, fodder, and other supplies, but the actual implementation of these requirements involved complex bargaining between military commanders and civilian officials. Soldiers participated in multiple economic systems simultaneously. In addition to official military pay and rations, they engaged in barter with local civilians, participated in the informal economies that operated within military units, and took advantage of whatever opportunities for profit or acquisition that campaigns provided. The trade in salvaged military equipment created markets that operated across national boundaries and followed armies throughout their campaigns. Weapons, uniforms, and personal effects taken from battlefields could be sold, traded, or modified for personal use, creating economic opportunities that supplemented inadequate official pay. Insurance and financial planning were concepts that had little meaning for most soldiers, who lived in a world where death or injury could eliminate all economic prospects in an instant. This uncertainty created a psychology of immediate gratification, balanced by the necessity of maintaining some resources for emergency situations. The economic impact of military service on soldiers' families was often devastating. Men who were the primary breadwinners for their households left wives and children dependent on irregular military pay, community charity, or their own ability to generate income through whatever means were available. Banking and credit systems had to adapt to the realities of military service. Soldiers needed methods for sending money home, accessing funds while traveling, and managing financial affairs despite the uncertainties and communications difficulties inherent in campaign life. The black market activities that flourished around military camps created economic opportunities that were technically illegal but practically essential. Soldiers, camp followers, and local civilians engaged in various forms of commerce that filled gaps left by official supply systems and provided access to goods and services that weren't available through legal channels. Prize money and bonus payments provided occasional windfalls that could significantly improve a soldier's economic situation. Successful campaigns might result in distributions of captured treasure, enemy equipment, or other valuable materials that were divided among participating units according to complex formulas that favored officers, but provided some benefits to common soldiers. The economic relationships between different military units created internal markets that operated alongside the broader civilian economy. Cavalry units might trade horses for infantry equipment. Artillery units might exchange technical services for food supplies, and engineering units might barter construction work for various commodities. Long before military camouflage became a science, soldiers in Napoleon's army developed sophisticated techniques for concealment, deception, and stealth that could mean the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failure. Picture yourself learning not just to fight, but to become invisible when necessary, to move without detection, and to gather information while remaining unobserved. The art of personal concealment began with understanding how the human eye detected movement, color, and shape in various environments. Veterans taught newcomers to move in ways that didn't attract attention, to choose clothing and equipment that blended with local conditions, and to position themselves so that natural features provided maximum concealment. Natural materials became tools for disguise and concealment. Soldiers learned to use mud, charcoal, and plant materials to alter their appearance, to modify their equipment so it didn't reflect light or create distinctive silhouettes, and to construct temporary camouflage that could hide individual soldiers or small groups from enemy observation. The concealment of fires was particularly important for units operating in enemy territory or trying to avoid detection. Soldiers developed techniques for building fires that produced minimal smoke, that could be quickly extinguished if necessary, and that were positioned so their light wouldn't be visible to enemy observers. Sound discipline was another crucial aspect of concealment that required constant attention and practice. Men learned to move quietly despite heavy equipment, to communicate without speaking, and to conduct necessary activities without creating noise that might alert enemy forces to their presence. The timing of movement was critical for avoiding detection. Experienced soldiers understood when enemy observation was likely to be least effective, how weather conditions affected visibility, and how to use natural phenomena like storms or darkness to mask their movements. Deception techniques went beyond simple concealment to include active measures designed to mislead enemy forces about unit strength, location, and intentions. Soldiers learned to create false campfires that suggested larger forces, to establish dummy positions that would draw enemy fire away from real positions, and to spread disinformation that would confuse enemy intelligence gathering. The observation of enemy forces required its own set of concealment skills. Reconnaissance missions demanded the ability to get close enough to gather useful information while remaining undetected, often in broad daylight, and under conditions where discovery would mean capture or death. Camouflage techniques had to be adapted to different types of terrain and seasonal conditions. Methods that worked in forested areas were useless in open fields, and concealment techniques that were effective in summer became counterproductive when snow changed the visual landscape. The concealment of equipment and supplies was essential for protecting valuable resources from enemy capture. Soldiers learned to hide weapons, ammunition, and food in ways that would prevent discovery even if enemy forces occupied the area, and to mark these hiding places so they could be recovered later. Urban concealment presented different challenges that required understanding of how military forces moved through populated areas. Soldiers had to learn to blend with civilian populations, to use buildings and infrastructure for concealment, and to avoid the surveillance networks that enemy forces might establish in occupied territories. The psychological aspects of concealment were as important as the physical techniques. Men had to overcome natural impulses to move quickly when frightened, to resist the urge to look directly at enemy forces who might detect their gaze, and to maintain discipline and patience during long periods of motionless observation. Communication while concealed required special techniques that allowed units to maintain coordination without revealing their positions. Soldiers developed systems of hand signals, arranged code words, and timing systems that allowed complex operations to be conducted with minimal detectable communication. The multinational character of Napoleon's Grande Armée created opportunities for cultural exchange and human connection that transcended the political boundaries and national prejudices of early 19th century Europe. Picture yourself discovering that hunger, fear, courage, and hope were universal human experiences that created bonds stronger than the artificial divisions of nationality and language. French soldiers serving alongside German allies might initially view each other with suspicion and cultural prejudice, but shared hardships quickly revealed their common humanity. Men who had been taught to distrust foreigners learned that a Bavarian soldier could be as reliable in battle as a Parisian, that an Italian could share his last piece of bread as readily as a Norman. The exchange of cultural knowledge enriched the lives of soldiers who might never have traveled beyond their home villages under peacetime conditions. German soldiers taught French comrades about beer brewing and metalworking techniques. Italians shared knowledge of food preparation and artistic traditions. Poles contributed expertise in horsemanship and cavalry tactics. Language barriers that initially seemed insurmountable gradually dissolved through the practical necessity of communication and the human desire for companionship. Soldiers developed their own international pidgin that combined essential words from multiple languages with gestures, drawings, and shared experiences that needed no translation. Religious differences that had divided European communities for centuries became less important when Protestant German soldiers and Catholic French soldiers shared the same dangers and depended on each other for survival. Shared hardship created a practical ecumenism that transcended theological disputes and historical antagonisms. The prejudices and stereotypes that soldiers brought from their civilian lives were constantly challenged by daily contact with people who defied easy categorization. The Italian, who proved to be a mechanical genius, the German, who showed unexpected artistic talent, the Pole, who demonstrated extraordinary courage. These individual relationships gradually undermined simplistic national characterizations. Food cultures blended in fascinating ways as soldiers shared recipes, cooking techniques, and ingredients from their homelands. German sausage-making techniques might be adapted to Italian spices and French wine. Polish pierogi might be stuffed with ingredients suggested by Spanish soldiers. These culinary exchanges created new traditions that soldiers would carry home after their service ended. Music provided another avenue for cultural exchange that crossed linguistic barriers. Songs that began in one national contingent would spread throughout the army, acquiring new verses, new languages, and new meanings as they traveled. Military ballads became vehicles for expressing shared experiences that transcended national origins. The celebration of holidays and festivals created opportunities for soldiers to share their cultural traditions with comrades from different backgrounds. Christmas celebrations might incorporate German traditions, French customs, and Polish rituals in ways that created new hybrid observances that reflected the multinational character of military life. Craft skills and artistic traditions were eagerly shared among soldiers who appreciated any activity that provided relief from the monotony and danger of campaign life. Wood carving, metalwork, textile arts, and other crafts created opportunities for cultural exchange and the development of hybrid techniques that combine different national traditions. Economic relationships between soldiers from different nations created networks of mutual support that operated across cultural and linguistic boundaries. German soldiers might trade technical services for French wine, while Italian soldiers might exchange their knowledge of local conditions for Polish expertise in horse care. The development of military traditions that incorporated elements from different national cultures created a unique Grande Armée identity that transcended individual national loyalties. These shared traditions helped create unit cohesion and esprit de corps that was essential for military effectiveness. Combat experiences created bonds that were stronger than any national identity. Men who had saved each other's lives, who had shared the terror of battle and the relief of survival, developed relationships that lasted long after the wars ended and often proved more durable than connections with family members who hadn't shared these experiences. The tools and techniques available to Napoleon's soldiers represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about surviving in hostile environments with minimal resources. Picture yourself mastering technologies that were ancient when Napoleon was born, but remained essential for military survival throughout 19th century and beyond. Fire-making was perhaps the most fundamental survival technology that every soldier had to master. Without matches or reliable ignition sources, men had to understand the physics of combustion and the practical techniques for creating fire under adverse conditions. Flint and steel were the standard tools, but soldiers also learned to use magnifying glasses, friction methods, and chemical reactions to create the sparks that could mean the difference between warmth and hypothermia. Water procurement and purification techniques were equally essential and often more complex than modern hikers might imagine. Soldiers learned to locate water sources in various types of terrain, to construct simple filtration systems using cloth and sand, and to recognize the signs of contaminated water that could cause illness or death. The solar disinfection techniques they developed wouldn't be scientifically understood for another century, but practical experience taught them that water stored in metal containers and exposed to sunlight was often safer to drink. Shelter construction using minimal tools and natural materials was a skill that could save lives during severe weather. Soldiers learned to read terrain features that would provide natural protection, to construct frameworks using available wood and rope, and to create waterproof coverings using their military cloaks and whatever other materials were available. Food preservation techniques went far beyond simple smoking and salting. Soldiers learned to use fat, honey, vinegar, and other natural preservatives to extend the life of perishable foods. They understood how to construct underground storage that would keep food cool and dry, and they developed methods for fermenting vegetables that actually improved their nutritional value while preventing spoilage. Tool creation and repair using battlefield salvage and natural materials was a constant necessity that turned every soldier into a craftsman. Broken weapons could be converted into cooking utensils. Damaged equipment could be repaired using scrap metal and improvised fasteners, and new tools could be created from raw materials found along the march route. Navigation techniques that didn't require instruments or maps were essential for soldiers who might become separated from their units or who needed to traverse unfamiliar territory. The ability to use the sun and stars for direction, to read terrain features that indicated water or shelter, and to estimate distances and travel times could mean the difference between reaching safety and dying lost in hostile territory. Medical techniques using natural materials and improvised equipment were crucial for treating injuries and illnesses when professional medical care wasn't available. Soldiers learned to create bandages from any available cloth, to fashion splints from broken equipment, and to prepare herbal remedies using plants they could identify and gather. Communication methods that didn't require modern technology allowed soldiers to maintain contact across distances and through dangerous territory. Smoke signals, flag systems, and various forms of coded messages enabled coordination and information sharing under conditions where modern communication systems would be impossible. Hunting and trapping techniques supplemented inadequate rations and provided fresh meat that could significantly improve soldiers' health and morale. These skills required understanding of animal behavior, knowledge of local ecosystems, and the ability to construct effective traps and weapons using available materials. Clothing and equipment maintenance using field-expedient methods was essential for maintaining effectiveness under conditions that would quickly destroy modern gear. Soldiers learned to waterproof leather using animal fat and charcoal, to repair cloth using improvised needles and thread, and to modify equipment to suit local conditions and individual needs. Weather prediction using natural signs allowed soldiers to prepare for storms, find shelter before severe weather hit, and make decisions about clothing and equipment that could prevent illness or injury. This knowledge was accumulated through generations of outdoor experience and was often more accurate than early meteorological instruments. Psychological techniques for maintaining morale and mental health under extreme stress were perhaps the most important survival technologies that soldiers developed. These methods for managing fear, maintaining hope, and preserving sanity under conditions that would break many modern people were essential for both individual survival and unit effectiveness. The psychological trauma that soldiers in Napoleon's army experienced was as real and devastating as any physical injury, though it was poorly understood by the medical science of the era and often dismissed as cowardice or moral weakness. Picture yourself trying to process experiences that would challenge the strongest mind while receiving little understanding or support from a society that glorified military service without acknowledging its human cost. The constant exposure to violence, death, and human suffering created psychological wounds that often took years to heal, if they healed at all. Soldiers witnessed friends die in battle, saw civilians caught in the crossfire of military operations, and participated in actions that conflicted with their moral upbringing and personal values. Sleep disorders were common among veterans who found it difficult to rest when they returned to civilian life. Men who had learned to sleep lightly to avoid surprise attacks, who had grown accustomed to the sounds of military camps, often found peacetime quiet disturbing and threatening. Nightmares featuring battle scenes, fallen comrades, and traumatic memories could persist for decades after military service ended. Anxiety and panic responses that had been adaptive during military service became problematic in civilian settings. Veterans might react with alarm to unexpected sounds, might feel uncomfortable in crowded places that reminded them of military formations, or might experience sudden episodes of fear and disorientation that seemed to come from nowhere. Depression and emotional numbness were other common psychological consequences of military service. Men who had learned to suppress their emotional responses to survive in combat sometimes found it difficult to reconnect with feelings of joy, love, and hope when they returned to peacetime life. Survivor guilt plagued many veterans who struggled to understand why they had lived while good men died. The apparent randomness of death in battle left many soldiers questioning their own worthiness and wondering whether they deserved to survive when others hadn't. Alcohol and other forms of self-medication became common coping mechanisms for veterans who found no other relief from psychological pain. The drinking that was common in military camps often continued and intensified after service ended, leading to problems with family relationships, employment, and social integration. Difficulty with civilian authority and social structures was another common problem for veterans who had grown accustomed to the clear hierarchies and direct communication style of military life. The subtleties and ambiguities of civilian social relationships could be frustrating and confusing for men who had learned to function in more straightforward military environments. Family relationships often suffered when veterans returned home, changed by their experiences in ways that family members couldn't understand. Wives who had waited faithfully for their husband's return sometimes found themselves living with strangers who bore little resemblance to the men who had left for war years earlier. Employment difficulties were common for veterans whose military skills didn't translate easily to civilian occupations. Men who had learned to function under extreme stress, to make life and death decisions quickly, and to lead others in dangerous situations often found peacetime work boring and meaningless. Social isolation was another frequent consequence of military service, as veterans found it difficult to relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences. The bonds formed with fellow soldiers often proved more durable and meaningful than relationships with civilian family and friends who couldn't understand what veterans had endured. Physical symptoms without apparent medical causes were common among veterans who experienced what would now be recognized as psychosomatic manifestations of psychological trauma. Headaches, digestive problems, chronic pain, and other ailments often had psychological rather than physical origins. The lack of understanding and support from society made these psychological wounds more difficult to heal. Veterans were expected to be grateful for their service, to readjust quickly to civilian life, and to avoid dwelling on their wartime experiences. Those who struggled with this transition were often viewed as weak or morally deficient. Some veterans found meaning and purpose by maintaining connections with their former comrades through veterans organizations, informal gatherings, and shared reminiscences. These relationships provided understanding and support that wasn't available from civilian society and helped veterans maintain their sense of identity and worth. Others channeled their experiences into creative expression through writing, art, or music that attempted to communicate something of what they had experienced to people who hadn't served. These artistic endeavors sometimes provided therapeutic benefits, while also creating historical records of military life that would be valuable for future generations. The official histories of Napoleon's campaigns focus on generals and battles, but behind every army marched a shadow population of women whose contributions were essential to military operations and whose experiences illuminate a largely hidden aspect of military life. Picture yourself becoming aware of these women who shared the dangers and hardships of campaign life while remaining largely invisible to official record-keeping and historical memory. Camp followers, as they were officially known, included wives and daughters of soldiers, women who provided essential services like laundry and nursing, and others who attached themselves to military units for protection, economic opportunity, or personal relationships. These women endured the same hardships as soldiers, while facing additional dangers and challenges unique to their gender. The wives who followed their husbands on campaign often proved remarkably resilient and resourceful. They learned to march long distances while carrying children and household possessions, to find food and shelter under conditions that challenged experienced soldiers, and to maintain family relationships under circumstances that would strain any marriage. Laundresses provided services that were essential for military health and morale. Clean clothing and bedding helped prevent disease, maintained military appearance standards, and provided psychological comfort to men far from home. These women worked under difficult conditions with inadequate equipment and supplies, often for minimal pay and little recognition. Nurses and medical assistants provided care that was often more skilled and compassionate than what was available from military surgeons. Many women had learned medical techniques from their families or communities that proved valuable for. And so, my friends, our journey through time comes to its gentle close. We've walked alongside the soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée through the mud and dust of European roads, shared their meager rations around flickering campfires, and felt the weight of history pressing down upon their shoulders like the heavy packs they carried day after day. As you settle more deeply into your comfortable surroundings, perhaps you can appreciate even more fully the simple luxuries that surround you, the warmth and softness of your bed, the certainty of your next meal, the safety and security that allows you to close your eyes without fear of enemy patrols or midnight alarms. The soldiers whose lives we've explored faced challenges that would test the strongest among us, yet they endured with a resilience and ingenuity that speaks to the fundamental strength of the human spirit. They found ways to create friendship and community in the midst of chaos, to maintain hope in the face of uncertainty, and to discover meaning and purpose even in circumstances that often seemed meaningless and desperate. Their story is ultimately our story, the eternal human struggle to survive, to connect with others, to find dignity and honor in the face of hardship, and to leave something of value for those who come after us. The specific challenges they faced may be foreign to our modern experience, but the courage, creativity, and compassion they displayed in meeting those challenges are qualities that transcend any particular historical era. As you allow sleep to embrace you, let the rhythm of their endless march carry you toward peaceful rest. Let their hard-won wisdom about survival, friendship, and endurance settle into your dreams like the gentle falling of snow on a winter battlefield, finally at peace after the storm has passed. Take with you the knowledge that you've shared, if only in imagination, one of history's most demanding and transformative experiences. You've glimpsed the price of the glory that fills our history books, understood the human cost of the grand strategies that shape nations, and appreciated the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Rest now in the comfort and safety that their sacrifices and the sacrifices of countless others like them throughout history have helped to secure for us. Sleep peacefully, knowing that their story, and now yours as well, will continue to inspire and instruct as long as people seek to understand the depths of human endurance and the heights of human achievement. The march is ended, the campfires have died to glowing embers, and the great army of Napoleon has faded into the pages of history. But their courage echoes still, their brotherhood endures, and their example lights the way for all who face their own challenging marches through the uncertain terrain of human existence. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that eluded those brave souls for so many years, but which they fought so hard to secure for generations yet to come. Sweet dreams, my friends. The journey is complete, and rest has finally come.